In this second part of our masterclass, Making Sense of Economics, a User's Guide, the proposal is that we've got some immediate ways to measure how a country is doing. Economic growth was the first tool that we put up. Employment, or the counterparty, unemployment, was put up as a second way of measuring and assessing progress. A third way of assessing a country's prosperity and stability and progress is inflation. By some arguments, the most influential, most important economist of the last 100 years, John Maynard Keynes, says inflation is the surest way to confiscate the wealth of a society. Very often when you think about public enemy number one, or when you ask economic citizens, what's public enemy number one? The answer will be, it's the tax person, it's my tax rate. Well, yes. If you're a marginal taxpayer, you might be handing over 45% of your paycheck. But if you're Venezuelan, you've had your entire paycheck confiscated, not by the tax person, but by inflation. The single biggest destroyer of wealth is not tax. The single biggest threat to wealth is not confiscation by governments. It is actually confiscation by stealth, and it is inflation. Imagine that you have 100 Rand and you put it under a mattress for 30 years. And you pull the 100 Rand out from under the mattress after 30 years and you go and spend that 100 Rand. What would it buy? Now, your economic brains have quickly translated this. Well, it's going to buy much less because of inflation. So this is what we call the consumer price index. Inflation is measured by the consumer price index, or we can be even swifter here as economists, CPI inflation. Consumer price index inflation measures the price changes, generally price increases that you and I face on an ongoing basis. By convention, consumer price inflation, or just inflation, is measured on a year-on-year basis. And if we say the inflation rate is 4%, then what it means is, on average, prices today are 4% higher than they were a year ago. And that's consumer price inflation in a minute or two. But let me make it more explicit or more graphic why inflation is public enemy number one. 1983, if you head into the streets of, well, choose your local suburb or local town, city, and you go and head off for a Wimpy burger, you're going to pay a Rand or two for a Wimpy burger. You go shopping for that same Wimpy burger in 2018, it's no longer a Rand or two. It's now closer to 70 Rand, a 35 times increase in the price of the burger. Now, meaning no observation about the product that we're talking about. We could be talking here about cars or houses, but the prices of things generally increase across time. And it might be the exact same burger, but it's going to cost you 35 times more. That is the effects of inflation. So you now pull your 100 Rand out from under the mattress that 30 or 40 years ago, that 100 Rand would have bought you 50 burgers. That 100 Rand today can buy you one, maybe 1.5 burgers. It's the same 100 Rand. It's the same burger. But think of what that purchasing power parity impact has happened, or that purchasing power impact that has happened. Purchasing power has collapsed. And it is not that the burger has become worth more. It's that your Rand has become worth less. And this is a fairly pernicious force. It generally doesn't stop. So the last chart that I showed you was 2018. Now we can flip forward a couple of years, 2020, and guess what's happened to the price of the burger? It has gone higher, meaning your 100 Rand buys you even less burger. This is John Maynard Keynes' point, that inflation silently, quietly confiscates the wealth of a society. And I've also made the point that this wasn't an argument about burgers or any other particular good, so I'm showing you some other examples here. Here's the cost of a car in the 1970s in South Africa, a few thousand rand to buy an out-the-box vehicle. That same out-the-box vehicle today would cost you not a few thousand rand, but rather a few 100,000 rand. So if you'd put your 100,000 rand under the mattress 40 years ago, that 100,000 rand could have bought you 50 cars. You pull that 100,000 rand out today and you try and go and buy a car. How many cars will it buy? Half a car. That is the impact of inflation. If inflation is public enemy number one, South Africa has been somewhat successful in taming or containing this public enemy number one. And in particular, under the governorship of Tito Mboweni at the South African Reserve Bank, South Africa introduced inflation targeting, where the objective became to achieve an inflation rate of between 3 and 6%. And in the data on this chart, you can see that South Africa has moved from an economy that in the 1980s was running inflation of 15 and 20% per annum. And in the noughties and teens decade, South Africa's inflation rate steadily got down to single-digit inflation. Now here we can introduce a really neat tool for working out, well, just how fierce or pernicious or evil is inflation, and it's the rule of 72. Grab a piece of paper and we can work out the doubling times of prices. And we use the rule of 72 to do this. So I'm going to give you a quick problem. If a country is experiencing an inflation rate of 20% per annum, as South Africa was in the 1980s, how long will it take for prices to double? 1985, 20% inflation per annum, how long will it take for prices to double? Then let's fast forward to 2020, where in 2020, South Africa's inflation rate is 3% per annum. How long will it take for prices to double? Do the maths, and let's meet back in a moment. Right, well, welcome back from the maths break. And the rule of 72 allows us to work out doubling times. How the principle works is you take the number 72 and you divide it by the growth rate. And if you've got 72 divided by 20% inflation, that was South Africa in the 1980s. 72 over 20, well, this is economists, so we can do approximate maths. 72 over 20 is 3.5, which means if prices are running at 20% per annum, prices will double every 3.5 years. So 20% inflation can actually confiscate a lot of wealth in a short space of time. Now let's fast forward to 2020. Inflation is running at 3% per annum. 72 divided by 3, well, amongst economists again, approximate math, 72 divided by 3 is about 25, which means if prices are growing at 3% per annum, it will take 25 years for prices to double. So there is still a confiscation of wealth, but it is much, much slower. By this measure then, South Africa has done very well, that we've gone from an environment in which in the 1980s we were facing a doubling of prices every 3.5 years to the 2020s where we face a doubling of prices every 25 years. That has important implications for country well-being. And we can compare this to other places such as, well, Venezuela keeps coming up as a talking point because in the devastation of the Venezuelan economy, they got into an environment of 1,000,000% inflation per annum. How on earth do you make any sense of that? Well, 72 divided by 1,000,000, well, I mean, that's a tiny rounding error. In fact, at 1,000,000% inflation per annum, prices are doubling every day, 100% inflation per annum. Your cold drink that costs you 10 Rand today will cost you 20 Rand tomorrow, 40 Rand the day after, and 100 Rand 4 days later. That is the devastation of inflation. So a last point then on this metric number 3 of inflation as a barometer of prosperity and well-being. Where does inflation come from? Milton Friedman tells us this is very easy to understand. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. If a country prints money you get inflation. And so what we want to pay careful attention to is how much money. And it's not that printing is bad, because low inflation, 3% inflation, we've seen as fairly tame. But if it prints too much money, and when a country prints too much money, you get too much money chasing too few goods, and the result is inflation. The consequence is the devastation of country prosperity. So how do we make sense of Venezuela in this environment? Well, that is exactly what Venezuela did. In around 2015, the Venezuelan government started fiercely producing money because they were unable to pump oil to get dollars into their bank coffers, and they replaced the pumping of oil with the printing of money. And the printing of money translated into devastating Venezuelan inflation. Public enemy number one and measure number 3 is inflation.